Nearly 4 years ago, the New York Times did a piece about what seemed to be a growing number of Republicans who wanted to do something about climate change. The article told the story of a clandestine gathering in a ballroom of the Grand America Hotel in downtown Salt Lake City, where these members of Congress worked through different ideas and proposals to cope with a warming planet. And the member of the House who invited them all was John Curtis, who has just been sworn in as senator for Utah. Recently, Curtis told us about that meeting. He said the question he was trying to answer was, how do you get Republicans to talk about climate?
Wouldn't it be amazing if we could get a few Republicans out to Utah to talk about climate? There's a couple of things there. One is I want Utah to be the leader on everything. That's why it was important for me to bring them out to Utah. And I think in our wildest imaginations, we thought we could get several Republicans to come to Utah to talk about climate. Imagine our surprise and our delight when, I've forgotten the exact number, I'm going to say it was about 18 Republicans said, yeah, we'll come out to Utah and talk about climate. Now, to be fair, more than one of those said, if there's any press, I won't come. Meaning, if my name's associated with climate, I'm not in. But I am interested enough to come and talk about climate. And these were not just ordinary House Republicans. And as they would RSVP, the staff would excitedly announce a new name that was coming. And everyone was an announcement and was a big deal. As it turned out, we had the top Republican on every committee of jurisdiction that had anything to do with climate. So energy and commerce, transportation, ag, all of these top Republicans came and they were willing to have these conversations about climate. I got to tell you, the day did not start well because we had in our first discussion a model that modeled carbon emissions if different decisions were made. And I think some in the group felt like, hey, I can't come out here and just drink the Kool-Aid. I've got to push back. And our first session was full of pushback. And in the middle of it, I thought, oh, no, if the whole day is like this, it's going to be a disaster. But we moved past that and we got into some real serious discussions. And I think everybody walked away thinking it was a tremendous success. I didn't go to Congress to be the climate guy, but I think we identified a void. People wanted to be good at this. They wanted to have an understanding. They wanted to not get caught in town hall meeting, coming across as if not caring about this great earth. I think another lesson is doing those things that are hard and the things that everybody else says can't be done is incredibly rewarding. I used to tell my employees when I had a business, they'd say, hey, that's hard. What you're asking is hard. And I'd laugh and I'd say, well, if it wasn't hard, I wouldn't need you. Right? And I think, people want us to do hard things, and finding that void and doing something that people said couldn't be done has just been incredibly rewarding.
This is Radio West. I'm Doug Fabrizio. Now, remember, this was almost 4 years ago, and a lot has changed, particularly the fortunes of Donald Trump, of course. When Senator Curtis assembled those Republicans at the Grand America, the future of their party and the MAGA movement was unsettled. Right now, it's not really. And President Trump has remained a consistent skeptic about the urgency of climate science and a critic of initiatives to tackle it. And yet, Senator Curtis told us he is still interested in pursuing a Republican approach to climate policy. But our conversation with John Curtis today on the program is about more than energy and the environment. We talked about the things in his life that influenced his thinking, that in turn influenced his approach to politics. We talked about his brief moment of rebellion, leaving the GOP to become a Democrat. While Curtis has maintained he's going to take an independent approach, here in Utah, he could follow one of two very distinct paths. He could align with Mike Lee, a staunch conservative and loyal supporter of Donald Trump, Or with Mitt Romney, the man he replaced, a constant critic of Trump. Romney voted twice to impeach Trump. Curtis didn't. But he was also deeply critical of Trump's role on January 6th, and Curtis voted to certify the 2020 election. He said he wasn't crazy with Trump's spending or his policies on China. Now, that said, John Curtis also aligned with Donald Trump's positions 90% of the time during his time in Congress. But let's back up. We began the interview with the senator's mom, Dawn Curtis, who was the first female president of the Granite School Board. This was John Curtis's first campaign.
There's a lot that I can identify, particularly as I get older, with my mom. I'm an extreme introvert, and I know, a politician, right? Yeah, elected official. And my mom was an introvert, and oftentimes my dad loved people, and people loved him, and he would be kind of the front guy at family reunions, and everybody would remember him. And my mom would have done all the work, right, and prepared all the food, and she was okay with that. She loved that role, and she loved her role in being the grease on the machinery that made the machinery go smooth. And my dad loved his role, and it worked really well. But think about this. Not only was she the first woman school board president in the Granite School District, she grew up in a town called Dingle, Idaho. Most people would not know Dingle, Idaho. It's a few miles north of Bear Lake, a very small town. Even today, it's very small. Her high school graduating class was 8 people. And she left that to go to New York City, and she received a master's degree at NYC as a girl from Dingle, Idaho. And the likelihood, right, that would happen, and to an introvert, right, somebody that's very comfortable, right, staying in Dingle, Idaho, it's always just found remarkable to me, and very, very inspiring. And so it was that same personality in her that jumped out and said, hey, there's some things in the school district I think I could do better, I think should be different. I'm going to run. I think back and I think, how bold was that for somebody who didn't enjoy, the public eye, who was just as comfortable in the background as any place else, to jump up and say, you know what, this is important, and I'm going to go do this. And campaigns, this would have been approximately 1975-ish. The campaign mostly consisted of literally photocopying 8x10 sheets of paper and stapling them to telephone poles around the Salt Lake Valley. And when I would campaign, I'd kind of laugh at that. And yet she did it, and it was inspiring to me. And I never really drew a direct connection between that and my willingness to jump into this arena. But no doubt there was a serious influence from that, and an example I think that was very important to me.
Was your family? I'm trying to imagine the dinner table. Did you talk about, like, I'm imagining in the 70s, like, oh, Nixon is in trouble, or what's going on? Like, was it, you can say whether or not they were Republican or conservative. Like, what was that sense going on in the family?
Doug, I'd love to, just share a few thoughts on that with you, because we rarely talked politics at the dinner table. And by the way, at dinner every night, a very traditional family growing up in the 60s and 70s in Salt Lake City, very Republican, very conservative, BYU fans. My mom was convinced every time BYU lost that it was the officials.
Right, that's right. And you were expected to all eat together at dinner, right? Like everyone had to be there.
Yeah. Oh, it was not expected. It was more than expected. It's just what we did.
Yeah.
And I miss that. I think, I tease my this new generation that soccer has ruined families, because soccer practice came along in a dinner hour and made it near impossible, I think, for families to do that. But, as I think back, I'm really starting to resonate on something that I call pioneer values. And let me tell you what I mean by that. When I was growing up, I wasn't taught what a Republican was, but I was taught about hard work. I was taught independence. I was taught compassion, helping other people, looking out for your neighbor. I was taught that you can do hard things. And now I look back at those values and those principles, and I identify them with the Republican Party because for me they were inseparable with the way that I grew up in a Republican household who talked about those principles. And I don't think I ever really questioned that they were political or that they only belonged to one party, which, by the way, I don't think they only belong to one party. But that is what I associated with the Republican Party as I grew up. And now, I'm starting to talk about those more because, as you know, President Trump's got us all reevaluating what a Republican is. And I think everybody, it's not just Republicans and Democrats are asking, what is our core? And I just find it very reassuring to go back to those same principles that my grandparents, my great-grandparents lived, believed, and I think tamed the West with and made Utah as great as it is today. And so my dad, to him, hard work was central to who he wanted his kids to be. It was the type of thing where he would have us move a pile of wood and then remove the pile of wood back where it was, right, just so we could have work.
Yeah.
And he loved teaching us about work. And my mom, this importance of education, the importance of caring for other people. I mean, all of these values that I saw in my parents and in their parents, I just think are fundamental to Utah. And I think it's one of the things that makes Utah great.
One thing you said recently in a speech about why it is that we have dysfunctional government, you said that elected office shouldn't be a person's first success, that voters should be looking for patterns of success. Do you think in those days, were you thinking in that, you were a young kid. I'm not sure you had developed any of these ideas yet, but in some way, did you think you wanted to run for office one day, but until then you figured I should do something else? I guess I'm also wondering, did you know where you were headed back
Absolutely
then?
not. Absolutely not.
Right.
I didn't. So I remember I served a mission for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Yeah. And when I left, my mom said to me, don't worry about what you're going to do when you come home. You go worry about being a good missionary. And I did that. And then I came home and literally 10 seconds later, my mom was saying, okay, so what are you going to do?
Right.
I said, well, wait a minute, Mom. I didn't know. And so I went down to Brigham Young University, not knowing what I was going to graduate in and what I wanted to do for a profession. And interestingly, this isn't this way for everybody, and I'm not suggesting it should be, but my life has just kind of unfolded and doors have opened. And then I didn't know beforehand, but then as I'm walking through that door, it's like, oh, that feels right. I'm doing the right thing. And that happened with my first job, and it happened with my second job, and it happened with running for mayor, and it happened running for Congress, and it happened in running for the Senate. And as you probably remember, I was very clear that I was not going to run for the Senate. I was also very clear I would not run for the House. And yet the doors opened, and a series of things kind of unfolded, which made it clear that that's what I should go do.
We should mention when you talk about what is your core, and I want to come back to that a little bit later, but we should mention that you were a Democrat for a moment. Now, I know some of this was more about the circumstance than maybe you adopting a different political philosophy, and you can explain that if you like. But what made you at least decide to become a Democrat for a time?
It was a rebellion, and I lived out of state. I lived in California and Richmond, Virginia for about 10 years and came back to Utah.
Well, there's your problem. You left Utah.
Liberal. Yeah. And, when I'm king, by the way, I'm going to mandate everybody leave for a few years.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I think it would be healthy.
Well, you mean that, right?
Oh, yeah, they can come back, but everybody needs to leave for a few years.
Yeah.
And get the experiences that my wife and I had are just some of our most priceless experiences that we may not have had we stayed in Utah. The friends and the experiences were just gold. But if remember, this is not the Republican Party today in Utah, but this is the party in about I'm trying to get my years right, but roughly 1998 or so. And I just felt like when I came back that, and particularly I was in Utah County, that this was a party that had zero opposition. This was a party where elected officials were selected behind closed doors, went through the caucus system and were selected, and people weren't having a chance to vote. When you're not having a chance to vote, there's no accountability. And I felt like that was not healthy for the party, and that going back to my business roots, competition actually makes us better. And so in my naivety, and I will admit I was very, very naive, I said, I know the answer to this. I'll change the Utah County Democratic platform. And I did. I changed the platform. I have a copy of it. If anybody wants to see it, it was pro-life. It was pro-Second Amendment. It was about a personal responsibility, and we were pro-vouchers.
Let me just underline this for listeners. You were chair of the Democratic Party in Utah County for I think correct. A year.
Yeah, and that was the platform, was pro-life, pro-Second Amendment. And I would at the time, I would have identified those with Utah County values. And I said, what I want to do is I want to give voters a choice between two people who have their values, because it's not happening within the Republican Party. And I jumped into a state Senate race. I ran against Kurt Bramble. He and I have since become very good friends, but it was a very competitive race.
Yeah.
Not competitive in the sense that I had any chance of winning, but competitive in how hard we both worked. I knocked on almost every door in the Senate district, which was mostly Provo, and tried to make the case that competition was good and that this would be healthy for the Republican Party. And I was totally unsuccessful in making that case. And people just wanted to go in and push the R, which of course is what I thought was actually causing the problem, is that of just no accountability. And you would think if somebody wanted a future in politics, there's nobody on the earth that would have suggested that was a good path to be in politics in Utah, right? And I just assumed it was the end of my political career. I tried it didn't work. It was a bad idea in hindsight, and kind of went my way and worked on my business, and thought that was the end of my involvement in politics.
Utah Senator John Curtis. We'll take a break, come back in a moment. You're listening to Radio West. This is Radio West. I'm Doug Fabrizio. Today in the program, we're talking with Utah Senator John Curtis, who has gotten a lot of attention for creating the Conservative Climate Caucus in 2021. So he's seen as a moderate, even though he hasn't really disagreed with Donald Trump's positions all that often. Still, he was critical of the role Trump played on January 6th. He thinks Trump spends too much money, and Curtis voted to certify the 2020 election. He has said he wants to forge an independent role as Utah's junior senator. Back now to our conversation. You have said that everybody should have to be a mayor before they go to Congress.
Yes, absolutely.
Why?
So mayors get things done. And as a matter of fact, mayors back here, if you've been a mayor in the House or in the Senate, you just kind of smile when you see each other. And there's an acknowledgement that you came here to get things done, that you know how to find allies and alliances. And let me pound on that for just a minute. I love Martha Hughes Cannon. We just unveiled her statue here, and I had a chance to speak. And I talked about her ability to build allies and alliances. And think about this. For her to get in the state constitution, the right for women to vote, she had to convince an all-male delegation to do that. You can't do that if you can't build allies and alliances. And I think that's such a forgotten principle in our government and in our lives. Is like, yeah, we're back here, we're on different teams, Democrats, Republicans, we're on different teams, but most of my time back here has been divided government. You're not going to pass a bill, and in the Senate you need 60 votes, which means you need some Democrats, right? You're not going to pass a bill if you can't get some allies and alliances. And mayors know how to do that. I think it's inherent. I think oftentimes that's why they run, because they're good at that. And I think that's what people in their cities expect and demand from them.
Senator, I wonder if I could ask a question about what you make of the current atmosphere in Washington right now. And let me explain what I mean. Like, I'm not asking you to stake a position necessarily.
Sure.
But I want to get a sense of your impression of, I guess, how delicate it seems if you're a Republican member of Congress. And I guess you know where I'm headed with this. Like, you may not be fully on board with one element, for example, of President Trump's agenda from time to time. You mostly are, but let's say you aren't. Do you feel like you have to be careful talking about it? Do you wince when I even ask the question, like, Doug, let me get on with this before we have to start seeing my name in the news somehow because I said something contrary? Like, how are you thinking of just general impression of the atmosphere in that way?
So let me go back to the campaign that I just went through not too long ago.
Yeah.
And I think what made me feel so good about the campaign and what people rewarded in the campaign was that from the beginning, I defined my lane and I stayed in it. And I think people are begging for authenticity right now in their politics. And it's hard, right? We have this almost this persona that as an elected official that's kept up by a staff of people and you get all these forces that push you. All the outside people come to Utah and say, if you're going to win, you have to be you have to pound the word conservative into everybody's head if you're going to win. And I'd been through enough not statewide elections, but my district elections to know, no, I think Utahns want more than that. And so early on, I defined my lane, and my lane was very simple. It's that, listen, I want President Trump to be wildly successful. I want him to solve our problems of affordability. I want us to deal with the housing crisis. I want us to fix the broken border where people are just we're making the worst of human conditions because of our border policies. I want these overseas conflicts to come to an end. I am going to do anything I can to help the president be successful. And these, I think, are quite not 100%, but shared by many in Utah, regardless of party, these issues. And yet, from time to time, there will be things that will come up. And I'm going to disagree with the president. And I think it's a false narrative that you are ever going to agree with one person 100% of the time. I've got a delightful marriage, been married 42 years, and guess what? Every once in a while, we just don't agree. That's life, right? I mean, it's not realistic to say I'm going to agree with the president 100% of the time. Therefore, I'm not afraid, and I'll make you a commitment that I will. I will speak up when we disagree. And frequently during the campaign, somebody would say, well, give me an example. And I'd say, well, you know what? In his first term, President Trump spent too much money. That's out of harmony with Utah's values. And even my most strident Republicans would say, darn, you're right. And so now I'm really happy that I did that, because now as I come to the Senate, I can stick to that and say, if somebody disagrees with that, say, well, that's what I campaigned on. And by the way, I won a 4-way, very hotly contested Republican primary with near 50% of the vote. I think people liked my lane, and I think it resonated. And remember, it's not an anti-Trumper. I want him to be successful. I want him to be wildly successful. And I support so much of what he does. But every once in a while, there are going to be issues that will come up. And I'm just going to say, with as much respect as I can, Mr. President, I disagree. Yes, sometimes that's not easy. Sometimes there's party pressure. But I think the way I campaigned and the way that I arrived here, I was able to set that up for that type of a situation.
You are a hard no on, at least I think that's fair to say, on former Congressman Matt Gaetz to be Attorney General. I think people would say you and a few others really changed his prospects. Not sure if you want to talk about that. But
well, let me just say we were right. President Trump has a far better Attorney General. It took him literally 2 hours to replace Matt Gaetz. I think he knew that, not maybe at first, but as this thing unfolded. And by the way, I knew things about Matt Gaetz, having served with him, that I'm not sure that everybody knew when they were critical of my decision, but I knew them. I knew what was going to come out in that ethics report. There were no surprises to me. And imagine had Matt Gaetz gone on, now President Trump is burdened with a candidate now who can't make it through, but is going through the nomination process. All of that, that almost yuck, I'll call it, that came out with his ethics report is now tied to the president. I think we did the president a great favor, and I tend to look at these as somebody would look at a board of directors. A president doesn't want a board of directors that's just going to say yes to everything. A president wants a board of directors that's going to see things he or she can't see, that's going to be honest with them. And I think that's what happened in the case of Matt. By the way, I never did say I wouldn't vote for Matt. I think people just knew that
you didn't need to say.
I didn't need to. Yeah. I mean, I never made that. I never even got to that decision point. But I've said Matt's toughest votes would be from those who served with him.
I guess people are going to ask. This is the question that would naturally follow. If Matt Gaetz, you didn't have to say, why wasn't Pete Hegseth a no? Or why wouldn't you have sent the same kind of message? I mean, you must have had some reservations, and I know these are different stories, and clearly you're thinking about them differently. I think there are those who may be who are oversimplifying, the narrative here, but who would say, how could you be no on Gaetz and okay with Hegseth?
Yeah, and one of the reasons that I didn't say no on Matt is because I want to give everybody a process. And now Matt's a little different because I did know him, really well.
Yeah.
But I didn't know Pete. And so I sat down with Pete early on, and I said, Pete, as an elected official, I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt that not everything that I read about you is true. I personally get that, right? And so I'm going on a mission to find out what's true and what's not true, and to find out who you are. So let's start with an interview. We had a long, lengthy interview, and in that interview, I asked him about what he'd do in his first 100 days, his first 500 days. And then as we were concluding, I said, I want you to give me a list of 4 or 5 people that I can call that will tell me everything I need to know about you. I want you to he'd written several books. I want you to recommend one of your books to me, and I'll read it. And I did. And not only did I call the people on his list, I called other people that I knew him. I'm fortunate that I've got a good circle of contacts back here. And I spent a lot of time trying to understand who he was, what he had actually done of the things that he was accused of. And I can tell you pretty confident that I've spent more time than anybody in the state of Utah trying to understand him. And I'm pretty confident I've probably spent more time than anybody in the Senate trying to understand him and what he's done and what he hasn't done, what he would do in this job and what he wouldn't do. And then layer in on top of that this is the president's prerogative to have the people around him that he wants. And there's a fine line between advice and consent given to me in the Constitution and giving the president some deference in his selections. When I was the mayor, I used to go to my city council in a very similar fashion, and I would typically say to them, now, it's not your name that ends up in the paper if these guys fell, right? It's me. And therefore, I deserve some deference, right, in my selections. And so all of those things came together. His hearing was part of that. The FBI report was part of that. All of those things were what I would call a sheet of music, where I kept putting notes on the sheet of music to see what we had. And particularly after the hearing, that was kind of one of the last pieces for me to put together. The scales tipped. And yes, I have some concerns, but giving the president the deference I think he deserves. And to be honest, a real lack of substantiation to some of the allegations against him. And, when I hired a chief of police for Provo at one point, one who was viewed as one of the best chiefs of police we've ever had in Provo, he had similar allegations, but they were anonymous. And I had to make a decision at that time, how much credence can I give to anonymous allegations? And I won't say it's zero. It's not. I don't take that lightly that they're allegations, but it's all comes together. And at the end of the day, I have to make a decision that I feel best about.
Let me come back to climate change. and the conservative climate caucus that you created. You've talked about how you wanted to pursue what you've described as a Republican approach to climate policy.
Yes.
What's a Republican approach to climate policy? Like, explain what you mean. Because part of that obviously implies that there's something, maybe not just Democrats, but maybe conservation groups or progressives, that they're not getting right. I mean, one of the things you've said was that, like, the Green New Deal, you say that gets a lot of headlines, but there's not a comprehensive proposal to fight climate change that's realistic, you've said, or that's effective. Is that getting at what you mean?
It's a piece of it. Remember, the whole purpose of running as a Democrat was that competition is good and two views are better than one view. And I think what's happened in the climate arena is because Republicans have not stepped up to the debate. In many cases, Democrats have been able to implement what they'd like to without being questioned. And so, let me give you a couple of examples. Yeah. Europe, I think, is a really good opportunity to see what happens when there was nobody to push back. A number of years ago, the environmentalists in Europe said nuclear was bad. Let's shut it down. So they started to shut down their nuclear plants. And in not all cases, France is a good exception, but in many cases, Belgium and these other countries started to shut their nuclear plants down because they were bad. 15 years ago, Europe produced as much natural gas as Russia, but the environmentalists said fracking was bad. Well, today, Europe buys fracked natural gas from an enemy. Those were decisions that I think should have been challenged. And so, number one, I think that we have a much better debate on energy/climate policy. I don't think you can separate climate policy from energy policy and vice versa. I think we have a much better debate when there's Republicans at the table putting our ideas forward. But what happened is, to oversimplify this, when I came here to Congress, there was a choice for Republicans between drill, baby, drill and Green New Deal. Well, they couldn't tolerate the Green New Deal, so guess where they went, right? Like, that was the only option. And as I started to look into this, I found that is just not true. There are so many things, and by the way, Republicans and Democrats agree on, and I'll give you some examples. So nuclear, zero emissions, right? This has become a very bipartisan issue. Not so 7 years ago, Democrats were not very happy about it, but the Republicans were not there saying it's a good idea. I think stepping up to the plate has helped change the narrative on the reality of nuclear and that we can't get to an energy future, green or not, without nuclear. Hydrogen, we have vast agreement on hydrogen. We have vast agreement on renewables. I like to point out Republicans don't hate renewables. We just don't think they're the only answer. Emerging technologies, there's vast agreement between Republicans and Democrats. Now, you can take one category, and it's probably fossil fuels, where you're going to find some good differences. That's pretty remarkable if you think what people's paradigm, the differences between Republicans and Democrats, is one category of many categories for energy. And so let's have a thoughtful conversation about the role of fossil fuels. I'm quick to point out that our natural gas in the United States is produced about 40% cleaner than Russia. Well, what's wrong with replacing Russian natural gas with U.S. natural gas? It actually reduces more greenhouse gas emissions than the Green New Deal. Let's have that conversation. And Republicans shouldn't be afraid of being beat on our ideas, and Democrats shouldn't be afraid of being beat on their ideas. But we need to come to the table and have these debates about what's our best energy source.
But, Senator, how can you come to the table? How can you be at the table if you withdraw from the table? And of course I'm thinking about President Trump withdrawing the United States from the Paris Agreement, the climate agreement. I'm guessing you maybe might not.
I think this is the mistake Republicans have made. We were turned off by the discussion, so we don't come to the table. Well, when we're not at the table, guess what? Decisions are made that we don't like. And this is where I'm saying, look, Republicans, we need to be at that table. We need to be promoting our ideas. And guess what? I actually think our ideas keep energy affordable. I think it keeps it reliable. And I think we reduce more emissions than my Democratic colleagues. Okay, bring it on. Let's have that debate, right? Like, okay, right? Like, if I feel that way, like, I shouldn't be afraid of having that conversation. And so this has been my point to Republicans. And by the way, there are now 87 House Republicans that have joined our caucus. And now when asked in a town hall meeting about climate, instead of looking at their shoes, they say, let me tell you what I would do. That is a much more healthy conversation, right? And they don't have to give up a single conservative principle to have that conversation. And that's what they misunderstood. And that's why they, like if your choice is Green New Deal or Drill Baby Drill, like I say, you're going to go to Drill Baby Drill if you're a Republican. But realizing that there is a role for fossil fuels in our future. And by the way, every energy expert in the world tells you we're going to be burning fossil fuels in the year 2050. Well, let's make them cleaner, right? Like, let's have that conversation. There's remarkable technology of direct air capture, carbon sequestration. Now, on the opposite side, some of my Democratic colleagues, I accuse them of just wanting to eliminate fossil fuels. And they don't know what to do with me when I say, fossil fuels don't cause climate change. Emissions cause climate change. So let's change the conversation from fossil fuels to emissions. Well, that's a fair thing, but if I'm not at the table, I don't get to make that case.
Utah Senator John Curtis. We'll take another break. Come back in a moment. You're listening to Radio West. This is Radio West. I'm Doug Fabrizio. Back now to our conversation with Utah Senator John Curtis. It's something you've pointed out as a congressman. You voted in line with President Trump's positions a lot, like 90% of the time. But what do you see in his agenda, or maybe here in his rhetoric, that you don't agree with? And let me just suggest something. Sure. Here I'm giving you a leading question. Money. You think he spends too much money?
Yes. Now, I will tell you that there is a different atmosphere in Washington right now, and President Trump's part of it, of we need to cut spending. And so I'm pleased with that. But that would be a good example if he didn't stick to that. I'm just telling you, Utahns, and I don't think this is only Republican, we're very fiscally conservative.
Yeah.
And I think you're exactly right. That's a thank you for leading that question, because a perfect example of where he could be out of line with Utah's values. And it's my job in the appropriate way. Not you don't see me. You know that. You don't see me out bashing people, bashing the president on social media. I don't bash my Democratic colleagues, but I'm going to push back.
What you want, I'm just trying to think how radical it is. You want the federal government to have a baseline budget like Utah has.
Yes.
Which seems so improbable, Senator. But make your case.
Listen, in 1974, we passed the Budget Act that we now pretend to follow. We've actually done our statutory responsibility 4 times since 1974. And what that is passing 12 appropriation bills, the House and the Senate, and then going to the president for signature. When we don't do that, which has been every time except for 4 times, we have 3 choices: a continuing resolution, a shutdown, or an omnibus bill.
Right.
Both a continuing resolution and a shutdown always end with an omnibus. So what we're doing is we're predetermining every year that we will get an omnibus bill. You cannot convince me that we will ever do these appropriations again. We haven't done them for years and years and years. Mm-hmm. And so I'm working on the concept back here that we need to reform that 1974 Act because it's not working. And so the baseline budget that you're referring to, it's a little bit different than what you see in Utah. What I'm suggesting simply is if we can't come up with a budget, instead of going into a shutdown or a continuing resolution or an omnibus, that we simply say stuck on last year's budget. And there's another principle that's important here, because from time to time, Congress has passed something so punitive that we think it will force us to save money. But because it's so punitive, guess what happens when it comes due? We vote around it. So that's not the answer. And so my suggestion that I'm trying to get some legs behind right here is decouple the 12 appropriation bills from each other and take away the time frame. And so think about this. If the paradigm was different and simply said, if you can't come to agreement, you're simply stuck on last year's budget, but you can move 1/12 of the budget forward by passing that appropriation, and the other 11 don't have to come with it. Some of those 12 categories, you maybe want to budget on an every other year cycle. Some of them you may want to do on an every 6-month cycle. And it's this false narrative that somehow they all have to be tied together and all have to pass at the same time, or you go into shutdown. And it just sounds remarkably common sense. Therefore, I'm struggling with it.
How did your LDS mission influence your worldview?
Yeah.
And we should mention, I guess I have two things in mind. Just that question, like what does that experience do for the way you're thinking about the world? But then maybe you can tell I want to head to China. At least talk about that as an issue.
Because they're certainly connected.
Yeah,
they're very connected. Imagine as a 19-year-old young man in 1979 in Utah, leaving the comfort of Salt Lake Valley in Utah, landing in Taiwan. I had the mission training experience like most, and I still stepped off that airplane and I said to the immigration woman who was Chinese, ni hao, which is hello, and she said, huh? And I said it again, hello, ni hao. She could not understand me even saying hello. Wow. That's how prepared I was for my experience in Taiwan. And then being sent out as a 19-year-old to a faraway city, a small little city, getting up every morning and knocking on doors and spreading the gospel. You could just imagine what I learned from that experience, how I grew. It was a remarkable experience for me. I loved it. I loved the hardness of it. I loved what I learned. I loved learning the Chinese language. I learned to love the Chinese people and the people in Taiwan. And I also learned that everything's not like it is in Salt Lake City. And I saw hunger and I saw poverty that I didn't ever see in Salt Lake City growing up. And I saw people whose God was different than mine. And imagine how healthy that is for a 19-year-old to see that and to have that experience. And I really came home from that 2 years later on fire in a good way. And it was so influential in my career, in my personal life, and learning that I can do hard things and have a good experience and learning the Chinese language. And now imagine, all these years later, all of a sudden I'm serving in Congress and I'm watching the aggression of not the Chinese people, but the Chinese government. And I'm always very careful to designate the difference there. A dictatorship who is oppressing their own people, and then watching that aggression displayed on the people I love in Taiwan. Of course, I'm going to step up and do what I can legislatively, and so much so that I'm proud to say there's a warrant for my arrest in Hong Kong by the Chinese government. And I got to tell you, that was great on the campaign trail. People love that.
Yeah, I saw you use that. I guess that worked. Yeah.
Oh, it was red meat all right. It was
right.
Good stuff. It was good stuff. It was a guaranteed applause line. And so I think because of not only my experience in Taiwan, but my understanding of the Chinese people, the culture, the language, I think I've been able to place myself in a very important place to help us fix our relationship with China. This is not a relationship that it's okay to have broken. We don't have that choice. There's too much importance for the world that we get our relationship right. And I like to kind of jokingly tell people, we don't want a divorce with China, but we do need marriage counseling. Yeah. It's imperative that we fix this relationship, both for our country, for China, and for the world. Well,
you voted to advance the bill that would force China to divest itself of TikTok. Yeah. And you've talked about how you see that TikTok question as a matter of national security. So I'm wondering, let me get you to react to your new president now. What do you make of President Trump's what seems like change of heart on TikTok now?
I'll tell you, I was on the Committee of Jurisdiction in the House, and the day that we were going to vote on banning TikTok in our committee, TikTok pulled a shenanigan, and they actually shut people out of their accounts until they would call their member of Congress and tell them not to support this bill. And for those of us who were members on this committee, and going into that day, that the bill had some people who were not going to vote for it. Coming out of that day, it received a unanimous vote, because what people saw is that a foreign entity, a company owned by a foreign entity, and not just owned, but in my opinion, driven by a corrupt Chinese government, had the ability to go to 170 million people. And just think about this for a minute. Let's suppose it's the day before our election, and 170 million people are locked out of their account until they watch a video produced by the Chinese with these algorithms that tell people, that know how to influence people, and they can't get their TikTok until they watch that, and then they can go vote. You're telling me that doesn't influence elections? And I think the people on the Energy and Commerce Committee saw that firsthand by that example and then voted that out unanimously. So I have that perspective. And if I could sit down with the president, that's what I would tell him. I say, Mr. President, let me tell you why we voted the way that we did. And I do get that what he's seen. What he's seen is, look how much good comes from this. Look how I was able to use this in my campaign. Look how we were able to spread the message. All of those things are true. But you know what that reminds me of? It reminds me of American business who for decades and decades and decades sent cheap things over to the United States. And people said, oh, isn't this awesome that I can buy a cheap toaster or a cheap lawnmower? Isn't that awesome? And all the time we were totally being taken advantage of and should not have allowed that to be happening. And I feel the same way with TikTok.
President Trump has talked about how, gosh, look how much they love me on TikTok.
Well, they do love him on TikTok.
Well, they do. But what raises the question, it does not seem like there's any going back now.
So we passed a law. The law is the law of the land. He can do executive orders all day long, and we'll have the debate, and it'll probably happen in the courts. But it is the law of the land. And in my opinion, his executive orders are ineffective. And you'll notice that I think if it's still the case, I know it was earlier yesterday, Google and Apple have taken TikTok off their platform because it is the law of the land.
When you heard President Trump's inaugural address,
mm-hmm.
What did that tell you about the challenges or the possibilities ahead?
I'll tell you, it's not only what I heard, it's what I saw. Your listeners should go back and look at something as simple as his tie. He always wears a red signature tie. He wore a purple tie. Grasp that for a minute and tell me if that doesn't tell you there's a little bit of hope for uniting this country.
But it was a pretty dark speech, Senator. I have to step in and say that.
So there were parts of it. Yeah, there were parts of it were. But I also think there were parts that were very inspiring and very hopeful. And I can just tell you that there is a different feeling in Washington, and it's dramatically different than 8 years ago. And 8 years ago, you remember, half the country basically came at it. This is, he's not my president. And we're going to fight him on everything. And they did. And this time around, it's you don't hear that at all, maybe a little bit, but not very much. But what you do hear is, you know what, we're going to find some areas to work on together. And I'm just telling you, there is a very different tone here in Washington than there was 8 years ago. And I think there are a number of issues that have transcended party lines. And I would say affordability is one. I would say overseas conflict is one. I would say not immigration, but border is one. Where the American people are saying, please. And I'll tell you, even these efforts to make government more efficient, that is resonating with people. They know their government is not as efficient as it should be. And that is resonating. And there are very high expectations of President Trump, and I feel them of me and of Congress right now to make substantial progress on those things I just clicked through and many more that the country, not just Republicans, are longing for. And that's what I felt. I by just a fluke of circumstances, I was literally 15 feet away from the podium. And so I was able to take in a lot more as far as vibes than most people. And yes, there were barbs. There were, some heavy criticism of the previous administration. But I think if you read that, go back and read it or listen to it from a different perspective and say, look, he wore a purple tie. That is a very different approach from President Trump than we have ever seen.
Senator Curtis, thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure, and I hope we can do it again.
That's Utah Senator John Curtis. Radio West is a production of KUER. You can subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. We're on YouTube at KUER 90.1. We're on Instagram at Radio West, and you can email us at radiowest@kuer.org. Our intern is Katrina Cano. The program produced by Benjamin Bombard and Tim Slover. Carrie Watson is our executive producer. I'm Doug Fabrizio.